So after World War II, the United States and eventually the other developed countries, so Western Europe, Japan, and then other countries who developed afterwards, uh, experienced what is often referred to as a golden age of capitalism. And we can see from this graph that real GDP growth on average was like 2 to 3 times higher than it had been previously. And the capital stock growth, so the investment in capital and new technology, was about twice as high as it had been, and certainly significantly higher than the previous period. And so, what was going on? Well, we had, for one thing, really high productivity growth. Um, that led to high employment and stable inflation up until the mid 1970s. The gold standard, which most countries had been using before the Great Depression, was replaced by something called the Bretton Woods system, based on the place in New Hampshire where they met sort of at the end of the World War II. And it was a currency peg, which meant that there was sort of a fixed relationship between the currencies. And that lasted for a while, for about 30 years until it fell apart. And the reason it fell apart was because of differing growth rates and inflation rates in different countries that made that peg no longer feasible. Um, a lot of economists believe there was this post-war accord where employers and workers shared the benefits of technological progress. Uh, sure, that might be true. In the United States, there was a whole lot of strikes after World War II in the late 1940s through the 1950s. Although that had settled down, so 1960s there were fewer strikes, and then they increased again in the 1970s. As we'll see, that wasn't exactly the same for all countries. And then the golden age ended in this period of stagflation where we had high inflation and unemployment. Um, and a lot of that had to do with both the increased power of workers to demand higher wages and these oil price shocks in the 1970s. We can see that a lot of countries that were significantly poorer than the United States caught up sort of by the 1990s. Um, so Japan started with GDP per hour of less than 20% of the United States and was above 60%. France basically caught all the way up before falling a little bit behind. Germany the same. And so a lot of these countries were able to catch up to the United States, become just as productive and just as rich in that period between about 1950 and 1995-ish. So what was going on in the labor market during this time? Well, profits were pretty high in most countries, and when profits are high, investment tends to be high. High investment means often leads to a high growth rate that creates more jobs, keeps unemployment low. Trade unions, which were important even in the United States back then, allowed wages to increase, and so as productivity was growing really fast, wages were also growing really fast. And a larger government meant that we had, higher unemployment benefits, um, and as well as other benefits, right? And so in the United States, we had, the war on poverty that started sort of at the end of this period. Other countries instituted, healthcare, national healthcare programs. So there were a lot more benefits for workers. If we look at union membership in the United States, you can see that it started climbing during the Great Depression, which perhaps isn't surprising given how much workers suffered during the Great Depression. And it topped out around 25 to 30% in the 1950s and stayed relatively high through the 1970s. Now, you should keep in mind that this is very low compared to most countries. A lot of countries have union membership that is, 50, 60, 70%. Um, but it started to fall off right at the end of this golden age, right? And so there were a lot of policies put in place that made it harder for workers to organize. There was some corruption within the unions that made them unpopular. And so union membership, fell to really low levels by, the turn of the century. Government size increased somewhat substantially and sort of has been steady since the end of the Golden Age at around 30%. This is government revenue as a percent of GNP, so it's going to include, transfers and transfer payments. So you can see that, this was rising during the Golden Age, and union membership was relatively high. So if we think about our labor market model, right, with our profit curve, our productivity curve, and our wage curve, we can think of the productivity curve shifting up and shifting up the profit curve along with it, and the wage curve only shifting up a little bit, not as much perhaps as it could, at least originally, and then finally in the 70s shifting up more and leading to that stagflation. So if we think about where we were, right, so after World War II, perhaps we're here, and then we get an increase in the profit curve due to mostly increased productivity, also a small cut maybe in the corporate taxes, and that and leads to a modest shift up in the wage curve, leading to higher wages, right, and lower unemployment. And so that's what we saw. The 1960s were a time of really fast wage growth, but still low unemployment by historical standards, and certainly compared to pre-World War II, unemployment rate was really low. So what happened? Why didn't it last? Well, eventually workers demanded higher wages. And so remember, I said strikes were high in the late 40s and early 50s. Then they came down. Strikes in the United States, but especially in other countries, increased fairly substantially in the early 1970s, demanding higher wages. We had an economy-wide productivity slowdown, which is still kind of a mystery. Economists aren't completely sure why that happened. And then we had these oil price shocks in the 1970s, which increased the price of oil, which then reduces the profit curve, right? So it makes profits lower. And so investment fell. We had higher inflation, falling profits, weak investment, high unemployment, which sort of took on the name of stagflation. So here we can see the days on strike. So this is an average across advanced economies, industrialized economies. And you can see that it fell in the 60s and then increased again in the early to mid 70s. It kind of peaked in the United States in the early 1970s, but it peaked in other countries, in the early 1980s. And then wages were much higher, right? And so we ended up with high unemployment and high inflation, which we'll see in the next graph. So what happens is, we get a wage curve that shifts up, profit curve shifts down because of the oil prices, and we end up eventually at point D. The problem was that, we wanted to be at point C with these high wages and low unemployment, but that led to a positive bargaining gap. We know a positive bargaining gap leads to inflation, and so we ended up with inflation and increasing unemployment as we sort of move down this new wage curve. And here's that picture. So the yellow line is the consumer price inflation. And you can see in the United States, it actually peaked at around 14% in 1979, 1980. It peaked a little earlier in other countries. And the unemployment rate was fairly high. We had a recession in 1980. The unemployment rate got to almost 11% before falling back down. But you can see, the average in the industrialized economies, was 2% unemployment rate, and that's super low. But then it was up to almost 10% by the 1990s. So what did we do? What did the governments do? Well, they put in a lot of policies that shifted the balance of power, right? So employees and workers and unions had much more power in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And then a lot of the policies that were put in place shifted the power more towards the firms. In addition, they really wanted to get rid of inflation, and so they raised interest rates, which led to higher unemployment until inflationary expectations fell. And they cut unemployment benefits. They reduced trade union protections. So in the United States, we had states passing right to work laws. We had Reagan breaking the air traffic controller strike in the early 1980s, and basically trade union power greatly diminished, especially in the United States, but in other countries as well.